you can see that that suffering also has some kind of a purpose that goes beyond just that the fact that it feels bad. Um, it can motivate you to do things, whatever. That's, don't worry about the specific examples, but that's basically, so it's roughly kind of what he's arguing in The Birth of Tragedy.
I've got a, okay. Now that we're talking about finding meaning in the suffering, I have this, I hate to mine you guys for data, but I'm working on this. I'm working on this paper. I'm working on this silly little paper for this silly little class I'm in. And a part of it, I'm trying to make this argument. I'm trying to fashion kind of the, I'm almost done with it, but I'm trying to fashion this last part of this argument about Nietzsche. There's this movie I watched called El Topo. You know, yeah, Chase, you know, yeah, dude. Just a really crazy Western flick by Jodorowsky. So I'm arguing that I think it's like a big expression of like the will to power, like throughout the entirety of the film. I think that it's like a huge theme throughout the film. Like it's just this like love and relationships and all that stuff. Like so many parts of social reality are presented in that film in the form of an expression of power. Like I like a lot of relationships devolve into games of power and of like resource acquisition, and it's just this amoral sort of thing that occurs. So if we're talking about finding meaning in the suffering, talking about meaning in the suffering, I guess I can see that. There's a point in the film at the very end. I am sorry that this is a spoiler, but too bad. At the very end of the film, the main character he was this bandito for this long time. He's this gunman. And then he becomes like the greatest gunman in the desert. Then somebody challenges him for his position as the greatest gunman. And he doesn't care. He's suicidal at that point. So he lets the guy shoot him a bunch. And then he passes out to die on this railroad track. And then a large group of dwarves and victims of incest or like victims of deformities from incest and inbreeding just appear kind of out of the desert and grab him and like drag his body into this like cave. He wakes up in the cave however many decades later, being like kind of pseudo deified as this like this comatose religious icon. He says, "Oh my God, what are you guys doing? Where am I? What year is it?" And oh, there are dwarves in Zarathustra. Yeah, if any of this makes you guys think anything Nietzschean, let me know because I need it for my paper. But so he says, "Okay, I don't want to be a gunman anymore. I want to reorient my life around helping you guys. Why are you guys living in a cave? This is so horrible." And then they say, "Oh, well, it's because most of us are crippled, sick, and poor, and the only way to get out of this cave is to climb out, because there's no functional route out for the old, the elderly, the weak, and the young. The only way to get out is through this complex like ladder system or whatever that like the young and the strong can kind of get out to get supplies and stuff." And he says, "Well, this is terrible. There's a town right nearby. I'm going to make it my life's mission. I'm not going to be a gunman anymore. I'm going to dedicate my life to helping you people. And so I'm going to dig a tunnel from here to the town, so that there could be some sort of free communication between this town of people that's been trapped in this cave, inbreeding and getting worse and worse as generations go by, to this relatively affluent town." So a series of horrible events occur. He busks, he tries to raise money, he becomes like a monk for a while, he tries to raise funds for this tunnel. Then his like another guy comes up to him and says, "You're the legendary gunman. I heard that you were still alive, and I'm here to finish the job and kill you." And he's like, "Oh God, look, I'm in the middle of something. I'm doing this tunnel thing." And then he's like, "All right, fine, I'll let you finish the tunnel." And so this guy is like standing outside of this like tunnel entrance every day with a gun pointed into the mine shaft and is like, "You better be digging in there." And he's like, "I promise I am." So he digs the tunnel, he finishes it, and then, and this is coming back to the notion of finding meaning in the suffering, right? The tunnel opens and the sick and the weak and the leprous come out of this cave. They emerge for the first time in however many years, and they leave from the tunnel and walk into the town, right? And it's the first time that they've interacted with the town. And immediately, like, and I love it because it's so like crazy that it happens, but everybody in the town, literally like every single person that is in the town that sees them is also like, they also have guns, and they all pull out their guns instantly and start firing on this crowd of cripples. I don't know if that's a PC term anymore, but these handicapped individuals are fired on and then slaughtered in mass. This crowd of like 100, 200 people that are like sick and weak and old are like gunned down in the street, and a big river of blood flows out from them. And then the guy, the main character, is played by Jodorowsky himself. He's like, I can't, I, and then he pulls out a gun of his own, and then because he's like a big, super good gunman, he kills every single person in the town. He kills every single person that lives in the town. And then once everybody's dead, he lights himself on fire and dies. And my thing, all right, is that I think that the movie up to that point, and without getting into the whole synopsis, was a lot of expressions of power and the will to power, I guess expressing itself or exercising itself in these interactions between characters, and kind of the notion of love and familial relations and things like that, all kind of dissolving for the sake of the will to power in a lot of ways. People abandon their children in certain scenes for the sake of like a loved one, like some woman that he loves, he abandons his only son at a monastery because some woman said, "I love you, let's run away together," and he says, "Okay," and then he tells his son, like, "Trust no one." And then he leaves him at the monastery. But so my thing is that at this final point, I can understand finding meaning in the suffering up to that point, you know, trying to free these people from the tunnel, trying to do all this stuff, trying to give up on being a legendary gunman. I can understand the notion of the struggle for meaning, but I think where the film, or at least where the character, at the very least, kind of fails to maintain its consistency in a way, his consistency at least, is that he allows like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people to die for seemingly no reason. And it's not for like an expression of power, or maybe it is. Maybe it's kind of like a signal of like where the will to power can go dangerously awry, where a man's radical project of self-creation results in like what is akin to almost like a genocide of a population, you know? But like, I part of me wants to say that like why does he light himself on fire? You know what I mean? It's like, is there like, and I guess that's the question, right? Like yeah, it's like the extermination of the not powerful, but like, and maybe that's just pointing at the ethical ambiguity of the will to power, I suppose, right? Because it's like a non-ethical thing, that it opens up room for things like genocide, you know? But like, I don't know. What are you guys thinking?
You know, I just to comment on the Hunchback in Zarathustra. You know, Zarathustra's often seen as sort of a parody of the Gospels. Parody, not in this, just in the sense of making fun of, but of an, you know, kind of an alternative twist on it. And a hunchback comes to Zarathustra and asks to be healed. You know, like someone would come to Jesus and ask to be healed. And Zarathustra says, I mean, it's been a long time since I read it, but you know, my recollection is he basically says, but this is who you are, this is what you are, and you know, this is kind of what defines your being. And so you need to, you know, like in this one quote from this week's reading, you need to be who you are and find your, you know, find an interpretation of your existence as it is that you find meaningful and fulfilling. So, you know, you know, the will to power thing, it's tempting to give simplistic interpretations, but you know, I mean, part of the whole will to power thing is self-overcoming as well. And so, you know, at least his comment to the to the hunchback seems to be, I mean, he doesn't say, oh, well, you're weak, you're broken, you should just kill yourself. You know, he essentially says you're weak and you're broken and you need to figure out how to overcome that and become something in some sense stronger than that.
Yeah, so the self what is the term for that? Whatever. When he lights himself on fire.
Immolation.
I think
Self-immolation, yeah.
okay, yeah. So I think that's something like, okay, I was just reading well, this book. Remember this one? Yeah, that was fun. And he talks a lot about the symbolism of fire. Okay, so basically in my essay, I'm connecting Nietzsche with Heraclitus, and Heraclitus, of course, with fire. So I see that there's a lot of symbolism going on there. Okay, so fire is something that, you know, it's self, it basically, it consumes itself in a way. It's a process that necessarily has to be destructive. But I think there's something like that going on in the sense of at least the Dionysian, as Nietzsche describes it in The Birth of Tragedy, that it's something that encapsulates both creation and destruction as necessary sides of the same coin in a sense. And I think fire is a good symbol of that too, that there's this kind of dual reciprocal necessity to basically the continuity of life as this larger process is like a fire that consumes itself. But in that consuming of itself, that also is what gives it its regeneration. So regeneration is both necessarily entails death, destruction, all these things, but then that's also the condition that makes the continuity of life through time possible. So I think that could be something like the fire consuming the person who's ultimately won. I mean, that's a very good symbol of this self-overcoming as well, which is a big part of the Dionysian, that, you know, any finite form, anything that's kind of just limited and frozen and still, that's going to be something that has its function, but ultimately it can be, if it's not fluid, then it's something that just needs to be broken up, because time will do that anyways. The fire of becoming will burn it up. So I think there's something like that going on. Also, in the Holy Mountain, there's, I think you've seen that, Hunter. I think I remember talking about that. But so there's this one scene. This guy is basically Jesus. He looks like Jesus, and these Romans make a bunch of plaster copies of him, just like hundreds of these plaster copies of Jesus, and he ends up destroying all of them. This very interesting symbolic way, but he keeps one of them. And then, long story short, there's a whole bunch of people that are supposed to represent the 12 signs of the zodiac or something, I think. Yeah, that's right. And they all have plaster copies of them that they carry around and lug around with them. This just this copy of them that's plaster and dead, and this is like in like a crucifix position. So that's representing, you know, this idealization of the ego, I think, something like that. But the thing is, they eventually throw those into the fire, along with all their money in this very that's this transformation, the Dionysian. And that's basically what that movie's about too, is enlightenment in a sense, but the enlightenment is it's definitely not typical, like the way you would see in like like Western Buddhist enlightenment, where it's like, oh yeah, enlightenment, because ultimately it's something that it's almost very Zizekian in a sense, if you've seen the end of it. I don't want to spoil it because it's actually, well, yeah, just watch it. The ending is really good. I like the ending a lot. Yeah, I'll just leave it there. Yeah.
Just to respond to Chase real quick, I have seen it. It's good. It's very good. Yeah.
I don't have any particular agenda. I don't know if Hunter, since you're going to have to leave, is there any here soon? Is there anything else you wanted to talk about?
No, I don't have any pressing. I didn't mean. I don't want to. Like this is my time. No. It's crazy. If you guys could see my desk right now, it's like a beautiful mind. It's like I am like getting into this weird like manic space of like weaving together this paper. But so far my desk is like covered in Post-its, so I don't have any space left to do that. So instead, let's just talk about like this last section that we read. I thought it was really brief, and I'll leave in like 15-20 minutes or something like that. But I just like this last, like for me, because I read like everything past 275. I read that all earlier for the Meaning of Life class. So all I had to do to catch up or to finish my reading for this week for this seminar was to read 206 to 275 up to the book 3, where it's written by like Sanctus Janarius or whatever. And everything there was really cool. It was really, really cool. All that stuff about depth and surface and like fathers and sons and like very, very cool stuff. What did you guys think?
I thought that the series of last whatever these are called aphorisms at the very end of that section of book 3 were pretty punchy. Well, I'll just read them. What does your conscience say? You should become who you are, which shows up later. Where lie your greatest dangers? In compassion, which is, I think, maybe it depends on the translation. In Kaufman's translation of Zarathustra, there's one point where Zarathustra says something like, my greatest temptation is pity or compassion. I can't remember which one. What do you call bad? He who always wants to put people to shame. What is most human to you? To spare someone shame. What is the seal of having become free? No longer to be ashamed of oneself. Anyway, I thought that was pretty, all of those were pretty interesting. And then those last 3 focusing on shame. I've seen, Nietzsche write quite a bit about guilt. One of these aphorisms in this section was about basically saying guilt is useless, which he kind of says in the genealogy as well. But these comments on shame, I just thought I'm not quite sure what to make of them, and I thought they were interesting.
I did like specifically with guilt. I liked 250 on page 149. Guilt, although the shrewdest judge of the witches and even the witches themselves were convinced of the guilt of witchcraft, this guilt still did not exist. This is true of all guilt. I like that formulation of it. I think this specific example of witchcraft, I think, is an interesting one to point to there on a lot of different levels.
I liked 255. That was my favorite. What? You want no imitators? I don't want people to imitate me. I want everyone to set his own example, which is what I do. So, I like that one.
Really, that section, the one that like literally 255 and all those last 3 about shame. I like writing this paper about like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Hegel and stuff. I usually am like, I want to be like, oh, like this guy was close, but he had it wrong, and Hegel was a lot closer, you know. But then I read 255, and I kind of, and I was like, this was like a couple days ago, so I was like, kind of ready to do it. And I just, it made me lose my fire, I think, in a way. It made me kind of lose my fervor. And then I just kept reading, and they got shorter and shorter and shorter. And then when he said, "What makes one heroic?" God, going out to meet at the same time one's highest suffering and one's highest hope. I I thought that was beautiful. And then just the 3 notes on shame at the end. I was like, I cannot feel justified or reasonable in like attacking this guy like in a paper. I would just feel like such a, pardon my French, but I would feel like a freaking jerk. I would really, I just did not, I don't feel, he does not, I really felt sensitive to his perspective, I think, in a lot of ways because of this.
There's several places where I don't, maybe not in this book, where he talks about vengeance and taking revenge. I mean, it seems to me to have some resonance with the idea of shame, or making other people feel ashamed. And as I'm sure you all know, one of his comments about the sort of priestly psychology is they're masters of resentment, and they nurture this resentment and they turn it into a creative force. But when he's talking about noble people, he says they feel they feel vengeance, but they just get rid of it in a hurry, and then they just kind of forget about it. So they don't, it's like they don't have a capacity for nurturing and hanging on to get to vengeance and thinking about how much they hate this person and what all they hate about them. It's like they feel this need for vengeance. They take vengeance, they're done. And he talks about like having certain emotions that are sort of a drain, like a trench that you drain all these negative, vengeful emotions away from you, so you can kind of get rid of them. I don't know why that seems to me to be similar to his comments on shame. He doesn't value shaming people in a similar way that he doesn't value holding on to vengeance for a long time.
And I know I'm always what I have, like with the 3 drums that I beat, which is like Spinoza, Deleuze, and Camus. But can I, and particularly Practical Philosophy by Deleuze. But I want to read like the first paragraph from that, because I think it, in particular, what Hunter said made me think of it, and it really kind of it made me giggle a little bit. So this is the first chapter from the first paragraph of the first chapter from it. Nietzsche understood, this is a book on Spinoza, by the way, having lived it himself, what constitutes the mystery of a philosopher's life. The philosopher appropriates the ascetic virtues, humility, poverty, chastity, and makes them serve ends completely his own, extraordinary ends that are not very ascetic at all, in fact. He makes them expression of his singularity. They are not the moral ends in his case, or religious means to another life, but rather the effects of philosophy itself. For there is absolutely no other life for the philosopher. Humility, poverty, and chastity become the effects of an especially rich and superabundant life, sufficiently powerful to have conquered thought and subordinated every other instinct to itself. This is what Spinoza called nature, a life no longer lived on the basis of need in terms of means and ends, but according to a production, a productivity, a potency in terms of causes and effects. Humility, poverty, chastity are his, the philosopher's, way of being a grand vivant, of making a temple of his own body for a cause that is all too proud, all too rich, all too sensual. So that by attacking the philosopher, people know the shame of attacking a modest, poor, and chaste appearance, which increases their impotent rage tenfold. And the philosopher offers no purchase, although he takes every blow. I don't know if that triggers thoughts in other people, but that was just very much connecting with particularly what Hunter said, made me giggle.
So that's from practical philosophy. Yeah, it's always interesting. If he writes a book on Spinoza, then there's all this Nietzschean, Bergsonian stuff in it. If he writes a book on Nietzsche, there's all this Spinozian, Bergsonian stuff in it. And then he always interprets one through those other two in his Trinity. Because that sound almost more like Nietzschean than Spinoza, but I see the connection there. Yeah, very fun.
A bit of a side thing too, but I was listening to a podcast today or yesterday about Spinoza. I forgot some guy. It's a pretty lightweight treatment of he just goes through a whole bunch of philosophers, and it's not very in depth. But the things he said about Spinoza, he was making there was no explicit connection to Nietzsche at all. But the things he was saying sounded a hell of a lot like Nietzsche. I mean, he was talking, and I don't know Spinoza well enough to know how accurate he was, but there's no evidence that he was trying to read Spinoza through a Nietzschean lens. But he started talking about power and about overcoming, and so maybe Deleuze is not just reading into things. Maybe there are real authentic connections there. So, I mean, again, I was curious what Sean might say, because I just don't know enough about Spinoza to say whether he was accurate or not.
Right. I mean, my sense with Spinoza is that I have a suspicion that Spinoza specifically was very influential on Nietzsche. It's always hard to tell with Nietzsche who exactly were his influences and kind of what goes into that. I think that I find that they complement each other very well. I think they have a similar metaphysics. I think they have a similar sort of irreverent approach to things. I think that Ray, if you take a Spinoza quote like I don't know how to do philosophy without disturbing the peace. There's simultaneously a certain kind of like that's you can feel Nietzsche reading Spinoza reading Socrates almost with that quote in a weird sort of way. So it definitely feels like there's a continuity between them. I mean, I do think that there are differences between them, and what I think one of the things that Nietzsche jokes about, or one of the phrases was and I was thinking about this one as I was reading it. What is it? That's it's only stupid people who constantly find similarities between thinkers rather than talking about their differences. So I definitely right, if I'm going to be a proper Nietzschean, I probably should talk about the differences between Nietzsche and Spinoza rather than their similarities. But I do think there's resonances there. Like there's there's another treatment that I saw Deleuze give of Nietzsche and Spinoza that specifically what you can sort of do. There's a certain kind of reading of Nietzsche's conception of power, where Deleuze starts talking about power to be affected instead of like power in this external way of the power to enforce your will upon others, but the power to sort of receive input, the power to sort of like actually gain knowledge about the world and actually apprehend it. That has these sort of Spinozist implications. The Spinozist idea of like radical sort of openness to nature as you're a part of it, as you're a contiguous element of God, right? In this kind of pantheistic sense. So I do think that there's Ray, if I'm trying to point to differences that I see between them, the major differences that I see between Spinoza and Nietzsche is that I think Spinoza hasn't accepted the death of the human in the same way that Nietzsche has. That's my best attempt to sort of like put my finger on what exactly I think is going on there. I think Spinoza has a genuine sort of joy in ways that Nietzsche can only be cynical and as a decadent, right? And I think Nietzsche recognizes that himself. I think it's a limitation of his philosophy that has to be overcome by splicing Spinoza back in, or I think you can achieve similar results with Camus, who I've been tempted to bring up a bunch of times, but I don't want to. So the death of the human in the post-humanist Overman sense I don't think Spinoza conserved himself with that problem, right? It's not that he wouldn't agree with it if you presented it to him. I think if you presented Nietzsche and his concerns over the Overman to Spinoza, he would go, yeah, I guess that's technically a thing that we would need to think about. But I think that so there's this part of this is me stealing again from Deleuze, because in practical philosophy there's this or actually it's not even the proper, it's the commentary of the translation that I've read of Spinoza, so I forget who it is who wrote that. It's talking about this idea that what Spinoza is still concerned with God, whereas Nietzsche sort of accepted the death of God as a fundamental assumption. So even though we associate the death of God as a concept with Nietzsche, I actually feel like it's one of the least important aspects of him to talk about. But there's a whole constellation of concepts connected to that I think you do have to talk about. Whereas Spinoza, I mean, what God is and how he functions is the thing that Spinoza is talking about, and it is a radically dead God in the sense that it's not the monotheistic biblical God. So in that sense, right, he's cutting off, but he is like trying to open up a whole other sort of trajectory of religious thought and opinion, if that makes sense. So I don't know if that explains the question you're asking, Evan. And then Hunter, death of inhuman core of humans, which makes us human. What did you mean by that? Or are you leaving?
No, I'm not leaving. Well, I wanted to, if I were to leave, I wouldn't do it until I read a fun passage. But just to talk about that for a second, the death of the inhuman core of humans, which makes us human. Zizek talks about this very explicitly. Hey, let's just beat on our drums, right, brother? We got our, yeah. If we're gonna beat on our drums, let's do it. Zizek talks a lot about he said, like, I remember being sort of this pseudo Freudian Marxist youth, the revolution is a big fuck, like he says, I remember back when I was young, I was really sold on this weird conception of psychoanalysis in the world and stuff. And he says, and I was a radical atheist. And he said, and it was no accident. I mean, I was a Yugoslavian boy, and I not only was told that it was a good thing to be like a secular socialist citizen, but also I remember going to the Ljubljana University and not being convinced by the attempt at orthodoxy that was being made by the philosophical department there, or like at least by some members of the faculty. There was this attempt at like a re-injection of orthodoxy into socialism, and he was like kind of put off and was kind of like, this is weird. But then he said at a certain point, I came to this sort of realization, I suppose, or this like internal conviction that theology is a necessary part of a sociological or like a psychological investigation, and it's any sort of philosophical investigation or project or whatever that or system that orients itself or includes like human psychology and experience like as like a big facet of itself. It has to reckon with theology. And he said, and that was my first sort of go. That was my first sort of gate opening up to the like warming up to theology. Like, okay, we like religion, we got to talk about it. But then he was like, well, actually, like maybe theology plays like a real part in everything. And he said, and that's what brought him to this point where he calls himself a Christian atheist, which is just super cool. I think that's super cool. But like he says, theology is the inhuman core of humans, which make us human. There is the thing beyond appearance that we call God. He says that for him, and as far as he can see how people talk about God, God is consistently the thing beyond appearance. If we could believe in like an essence or something, people would find God in it. If we want some substantial order or structure or spirit or something, that is in a way our God. And he says, okay, you can have that more direct and overt, like there's an ordered God who presents us with an ordered universe, versus like a Kierkegaardian thing where it's like there's no order to anything and everything sucks. But because of that, like in that, like this discord and chaos is the evidence that there is this to suggest that there's this thing beyond appearance that we have no choice but to have faith in. I have to have utter faith in the thing beyond appearance, because it literally does not appear, not even in the form of a pattern that we can pick out. Like, cause some people, like other traditional theologists, would be like, oh, there are signs of God everywhere, or when I pray, I feel God's warmth in me or whatever. But Kierkegaard is like, no, it's totally beyond appearance. It'll never show itself to you. And that's what makes it faith, right? And in that same way, the super sensible, or the thing beyond appearance, plays this, at least according to the logic of that Zizek describes, like in Lacan and Hegel, it plays this very necessary element in making us feel mortal and giving us a sense of unity of things. And it compels us to do stuff. It compels us to do certain things. Like for Hegel, he says it's what moves us from consciousness to self-consciousness is when we misrecognize the world as having substantial content behind appearance, as having some sort of hidden inner essence, and then we peer behind the veil of appearances and see a black void nothingness. And then he says that's the moment that you realize the only stuff that's there is the stuff you put there. So the thing beyond appearance, in a way, is you. And you are spirit, you are the thing. But then Lacan takes, I don't know how the two connect, but I know Lacan has this, this is Lacan's critique of Ponty, actually. Lacan does seminar on the visible and invisible, where he said Ponty's biggest misrecognition or misstep for Lacan in his logic was arguing that the things compel us to see them rather than a drive within the human subject which compels it to see. He said the big split is that Ponty places the onus, in a way, on the things out there that are compelling us to see them rather than an ocular drive. Basically, for Ponty, the split is between the object and the subject, right? The thing and the vision of that thing. But for Lacan, it's between the eyeball and sight. It's like this. He defines experience as being oriented around this series of drives, where like we have an ocular drive to look, and I have an oratory drive and an anal drive and a phallic drive and things like that to kind of orient my experience. I don't know why not porque no las dos. You know what I mean? I really don't. I straight up, I don't know what his big deal, but I know what I remember a cool thing he said that might give us a hint. I don't know. I might have to reread it. But he said Ponty gave in to a fundamental urge of the human experience, which is to see a thing beyond appearance and to perform a sacrifice for this strange power beyond our conception. And he said human beings interact with things that have some void or element beyond appearance, right? And Lacan basically describes it as like a story of like human beings will come up against appearance and wish for something else or kind of see something else behind it. And then we'll just kind of freak out and get afraid of it and be like, oh God, there's something back there. There's something hidden behind the veil of appearances. Let's kill stuff and maybe it'll leave us alone or give us rain or something. And he sees Ponty as doing that in a way. He sees Ponty as like doing self-sacrifice of his own drives and powers as a subject in service of this external power beyond appearance. And I don't really know the meat and potatoes of that critique, but I know that it exists. But I just wanted to, on the note of Nietzsche, back to Nietzsche, talking about the differences between philosophers, rather than the similarities between philosophers. I will say, I know that he's hardline and rigorous and very like, you gotta be, you gotta talk smart. You gotta talk about differences between philosophers because, stupid people talk about the similarities. Okay. And like, for the sake of genuine, intellectually honest investigation of philosophies, it's better to recognize that no two human acts and no two human projects are the same. And to give dignity to these thinkers, it's important to recognize what risks they took and what leaps they leapt and how they broke away and rebelled and denied and tried to do something new, rather than just kind of melting them down into this grand pot of Western canon or whatever. I can definitely see the value in that. But at the same time, I guess there are certain parts of the book, maybe it's just me projecting into it, but I see Nietzsche as like, not like a hard, like not a total, like, you know, blowhard. You know, I see him as being kind of sensitive to things and not being, and this is part of my sensitivity to why I don't want to make this paper just lambasting him or like just totally like, you know, going on this derisive thing. And one section that I guess kind of really gets my point across as to where I think Nietzsche and I see eye to eye. I mean, I see eye to eye with him in a lot of ways, but this particularly on 279, again, one of the most beautiful sections in the book, 279, called Star Friendship. Oh my God. I'm going to just read the whole thing and then you guys can talk at me and then I'll be like, all right, well, that was good. And then I'll leave. So, because I want you guys to be able to respond if you have any response to anything I said. So he says, Star Friendship. We were friends and have become estranged, but this was right, and we do not want to conceal and obscure it from ourselves as if we had reason to feel ashamed. That's kind of a note on the shame thing. That's a further like solidification of his idea that shame has no place in philosophy. We are two ships, each of which has its own goal and course. Our paths may cross, and we may celebrate a feast together as we did. And then the good ships rested so quietly in one harbor and in one sunshine that it may have looked as if they had reached their goal and as if they had one goal. But then the almighty force of our tasks drove us apart again into different seas and sunny zones, and perhaps we shall never see each other again. Perhaps we shall meet again, but fail to recognize each other. Our exposure to different seas and suns have changed us. That we have to become estranged is the law above us. By the same token, we should also become more venerable for each other and the memory of our former friendship more sacred. There's probably a tremendous but invisible stellar orbit in which our very different ways and goals may be included as small parts of this path. Let us rise up to this thought. But our life is too short and our power of vision too small for us to be more than friends in the sense of this sublime possibility. Let us then believe in our star friendship, even if we should be compelled to be Earth enemies. And I just think, oh, it's just so sweet. Ain't that just the sweetest dang thing you ever heard? Come on, he is just such a sweetheart. I love that.
I think one thing he does in numerous places is complicate the difference between friendship and being enemies. So, you know, he'll say things some places that, you know, kind of like your best friend is your best enemy. I remember there was some Westerns that you were talking about movies. I can't remember which one it is, but there was some movie where there were these two opposing armies, and these two guys from each army ended up sort of isolated, and they're facing each other, and one shoots the guy's hat off, and then the other guy shoots his gun belt, and then the other guy shoots the belt in his pants, and his pants fall down. And so, you know, they're shooting each other like this, and then all of a sudden a shot comes from out of nowhere and kills one of the guys. And it was someone from, you know, one of the guy's armies that had come up and saw that he was fighting one of the enemy and killed him. And the other guy was just heartbroken. And, you know, so sometimes you get this thing in Nietzsche where even enemies are, you know, because he's got this big thing about respect and the way, I mean, sometimes he talks about, you know, like with warriors and so on, but you respect the people who are also powerful, even if they're opposing you. And those are the people who command the most respect. And so, you know, there's this ambiguity, again, between friendship and being enemies. And so this is, like you said, this is much sweeter than that, but still, it just reminds me of, again, him sort of complicating, you know, this clear distinction between friendship and being enemies.
Maybe a weird direction taken, a bit based on just what Nevitt was talking about. That specifically made me think of the Christmas truce for some reason, the World War I Christmas truce, which has always struck me as such like an interesting. It's an alternate history hub did a video where they talked about like basically an alternate history situation where the Christmas truce had instead of ending, you know, it was like very like consciously ended by the powers that be, and then they made sure it didn't happen again. But the idea that it had somehow like expanded and like actually ended World War One. I mean, I think that there's like an interesting element of that. This feels like a very un-Nietzschean angle to focus on with respect to the question, but I do think, right, if we're saying that there's an ambiguity between, sort of friendship and competition, or being friends and being enemies, that flows in both directions. And I think one of the interesting ways that does flow in both directions is that it facilitates like the human capacity to suddenly overcome vast kinds of differences in order to create like a kind of I don't know, a new possibilities, I guess, is the only like the only way that I can feel like I can talk about this is in like Deleuzian terms, where it's just like, suddenly the ground can shift fundamentally under your feet, and you can go in sort of a new direction. And I think that if that respect is interesting to me, because the other direction that we can come into this is sort of the things that Hunter and was talking about, like, oh, like your friends almost as like kind of a worthy enemy, in the sense that like, oh, well, I can actually have discussions with them and I can get into arguments with them, which maybe this is overly revealing, but I find that to be like a serious issue in my love life. Like I don't find very many people that I can like have arguments with and then us like still be on like good terms afterwards, either like purely intellectual arguments or like actual like interpersonal disputes with. And I find that very frustrating. I'm just like, well, no, then I'm not interested in like not, and totally like I'm not like interested in conflict with my significant others for its own sake. But like if we can't have conflict and then that be like a beautiful enlivening of the relationship, if it's just something that has to be patched over, or like then I don't like that. I find that unpleasant, and it doesn't really work for me in terms of the dynamics of a relationship. So that's I think that there's something to, if there's sort of like what is the way that Roderick puts it, that there's sort of like a latent sort of anarchistic reading of Marx in Nietzsche, right? Even though Nietzsche would never admit to it, I think there's something there, right, in terms of like this vast human capacity to like take conflict and revivify it as something that like is productive. I know I've been talking for a while, but I did want to specifically say that is kind of my response to everything that y'all were saying earlier about pain and its value. Is that I think in particular Thich Nhat Hanh was very influential to this on me, right? This sort of Zen or Zen, but like Vietnamese Zen, so Zen Buddhist monk who I remember in what is it, The Essence of the Buddhist Teaching, or The Heart of the Buddhist Teaching, that's the name of the book. He kind of talks about this concept of like what enlightenment means isn't necessarily like the incapacity to feel pain, or this incapacity to like be engaged with the world. So he's also like one of the key figures in this movement called Engaged Buddhism, which is supposed to be this very sort of politically aligned interpretation of Buddhism, this Buddhism that was interested in being engaged with the world. But like this capacity to be transformative, to actually like take suffering and turn it into something else. And my argument with respect to the concept of suffering, I think, and particularly in response to the concept that y'all are talking about with respect to James, is that is totally the wrong approach to dealing with suffering. The idea that the way that suffering should be evaluated, not evaluated, but evaluated, is by contextualizing it, by making it part of a larger sort of grander scheme I view as an ethical abdication. And I obviously think that because I'm a Camus boy, right? But trying to say that suffering would be justified if it was contextualized, there's no justification that can justify suffering. Whatever justification you provide is fundamentally unjustifiable. But what you can do, what I think is the power that human beings have with respect to the question of suffering, is this capacity to weaponize it in the sense that it can be retooled, it can be redirected, it can be made into a force, and it's a force that fundamentally can change things. And so my sort of like Camusian absurdist response is to say that it's not that suffering is ever justifiable, it's that we as humans should take up suffering, we should artistically aim it at things, we should turn it into the political force to alter the world, we should sort of give it this, we should sanctify it in the sense that we should give it this radical transformative power. But to ever admit, to ever read whatever, I don't know, Zizekian, Lacanian, Freudian interpretations and that, but to ever admit that it has any sort of legitimacy or justifiability in context, I find utterly disgusting. I'm not with that.
Yeah, I just want to say that I relate to what you said about, being able to have conflicts, especially with a significant other. I think that like I just there's like it's very hard for me to differentiate between being comfortable with conflict and seeking conflict, and especially like getting that across to someone else, that I kind of see myself as having these opportunities to conflict with someone, and throughout most of my life remaining silent, like avoiding conflict. And now I'm sort of in a place where I have a better idea of why I want to create conflicts, why, like I'll see a potential conflict and kind of want to create it. Not for some solution or some, justifiable goal, but it's just me trying to express myself, but at the same time, part of that is just kind of like, yes, exactly. It's part of it is just kind of fun, to me, and interesting, and it kind of exciting, and to some extent, I don't want that to like in a real sense. I was thinking about this when I was reading Nietzsche. I don't want to bring shame to people because of that. I don't want me creating conflict to cause other people to feel shame, and that's a question that I am kind of dealing with currently, is like, can I express myself without shaming other people? And who can I express myself to? Who can I, create these conflicts with? And because the people who I can create conflicts with are my closest friends, genuinely. And so, but I also don't want to, sort of disregard the friendships that don't want to create conflicts, because I think those are still valuable as well. But
I really like that. I don't know if I have anything additional to add to it, but I really like it, Travis.
One of the things, I don't know, maybe this is just turning into too much of a self-help confession forum, but one of the things I struggle with, which the shame thing reminds me of, is when I I'm conflict avoidant, and I don't like the feeling of conflict. And so for me, it's hard for me to experience conflict without feeling both shame and guilt. And so what happens to me, like, when Hunter was talking about that conversation we had in class yesterday, where he and I and Matthew were anyway, we were strenuously, and I think emotionally, arguing for opposing viewpoints. It's hard for me not to feel bad afterwards. And I think that bad is kind of a combination of shame and guilt, even though I think, like Matthew and Hunter both were on the same page as me in terms of there's really no need to feel either guilt or shame there. We were having an authentic disagreement. And after the fact, we had a conversation, and we were all just talking like, it didn't have that air of sort of fearful, tenuous conversation because we don't, we're worried we were just having, and so anyway, that's what that connected to that notion of shame and guilt, and of Nietzsche, suggesting that those are either not very valuable or useless emotions. especially in the philosophical context. I hear him speaking to me, as if that's something I need to listen to.
That specifically reminded me of a thing that happened to me and Stefan when we were sort of having a discussion with each other, and I think I was like taking the bus with him home, so that, or he was taking the bus home with me so that I could drop him off to pick up his car or something like that, because normally we weren't on the bus together, particularly like at this time. And we were having some sort of like philosophical discussion about our ideas, and apparently we were getting really loud because somebody else on the bus sort of turned to us and goes, girls, you're both pretty. And neither of us knew how to respond to that, because we didn't even recognize that other people existed at this point, right? Like we were in the debate, and then so suddenly we had to like shift and start talking with this person and be like, no, we're actually really good friends. We were having a really good time. Like this is totally fine. I promise you, we weren't like about to rip each other's throats out. I don't know if it sounded like that. That was always one of, because I'm I'm very conflict avoidant. Like I hate it. It really makes me anxious, and I was always like a very timid child. And I kind of like treat philosophy as like this weird sort of workaround that I can do, where it's like, well, if conflict's philosophical, then it doesn't really have like this emotional weight to it, right? And so I can kind of like sidle around that feeling, or like it doesn't always go away, like, but I do find that philosophy at least helps. I feel less guilty and less shameful when I disagree with people because I'm doing it philosophically. And I guess this ties back into the other thing that I was saying, where a lot of people I've dated don't have the same opinion, that when we disagree, but it's philosophical, it's therefore isn't an argument, and that this leads to internal tension in the relationship.
Well, it may be in bad taste, and going back to the text here, but I don't know if you want to say anything about like 276. He brings in amor fati, which is always interesting and confusing for me. And then this again, this issue of freedom versus, I think determinism is not the right word, but freedom versus unfreedom. I don't know. And because he both talks about, there's these sort of deterministic feelings in some passages, like become who you are. Although I'm wondering if become who you are is actually the place where those two meet for him, is exactly the kind of crux where those two seeming opposing ideas cross, because he has this, all this stuff about become who you are, and all this stuff about my will is really just the affect of command. It's the feeling of one drive overcoming all the other drives, these kinds of things. But then like almost very shortly after the amor fati passage, he talks about self-creation, and so anyway, I it's just, those are unresolved themes in my mind, and I have kind of some tentative solutions for them, but I've never, as much Nietzsche as I've read, I've never been able to really make that all work out in my mind.
Yeah, that was another passage for me that felt like he was like attacking me. But at the same time, it was like, for me also, it was like, this is my sort of one of my greatest insecurities, that I can't sort of look at my life and my fate and the people around me and just enjoy it, and have fun and see the beauty in it, and I don't know, I guess I had to kind of read this as him stating his own insecurity in a sense, being like, despite the fact that this isn't what he's able to do, it's interesting to him, and it's something that he wants to be able to do. And although it's not perfect, and clearly he's not doing this, throughout the rest of the book, in a lot of ways he is pointing out the ugliness and he is accusing, and but I can see him as really being like, but there are times, maybe in the new year, in these moments where I just want to look at things and say yes.
I know it's in this book. I can't remember if it's before or after we are, because we've been reading this book in the meaning of life class, and so I can't remember where it is, but he taught, oh, here it is. It's on it's ahead, it's on 341, section 341, page 194 in this version, but it's where he talks about eternal recurrence, which I think is a close, closely related to amor fati. And he says, what if some day or night a demon were to steal into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, this life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once again and innumerable times, and there will be nothing new in it. And the last sentence, how well disposed would you have to become to yourself and to life to long for nothing more fervently than for this ultimate eternal confirmation and seal. And there's some evidence that he thought of this as a literal thing. There may it had to do with the science of his time and so on, but it seems to be clearly to be an existential test. Can you do this? Kind of like the amor fati. Like you were saying, it's not clear he can, but it's what he wants to do. He wants to affirm his life so much that he could say, yes, I want to live this life over and over. And oh God, I fail that test. I mean, it's like, hell no, I don't want to live this life over. But at the same time, there's something very attractive to me about that, to say, to be that affirming of life. And so it's a challenge, but I guess I'm in spite of the fact that I personally find that to be a terrible idea. I think the fact that he throws it out as a possible test of my affirmation of existence is a good thing, for me to contemplate. Why can't I do that? But anyway, I kind of have the same feeling that Travis did. It's like, I'm not sure Nietzsche himself is in a place where he can do that, but it's at least something he wants to aspire to. I guess the question is that really something we ought to aspire to? But I don't know.
If I'm allowed to be overly analytical, I kind of am tempted to say it's a necessary but not sufficient condition for a good life. But the other thing I was going to say is the only thing that I think really made that concept make sense to me was, I forget who, it was probably Rick Roderick, because I get all this shit from him, is the specific use of the example of Hamlet, and basically going, what would it even look like to will to live a life again and again and again and again, and the point that I remember being made was basically, well, people keep putting on this play of Hamlet, and they keep playing this character of Hamlet, and they keep doing it over and over and over again, and they keep doing it the same, right? They keep doing this with the same lines, even the same words, even as Shakespearean English is getting older and older and more distant from the language that we speak. The words themselves are so resonant. You can choose to update them if you want to, but you can leave them in the original, and it still has all this power. And so to say that, oh well, what would a life even look like that could be lived or willed like this? That's the only example I can really think of, is to say, oh well, this one would. And the interesting thing there is that there's definitely this. That's not a right. Whether or not he made the right decisions, Hamlet, questionable. Whether or not that's the way that you should have done things, questionable, right? Like, it's questionable all the way down, but just the force of that life and the force of the decisions that were made, so beautiful.
I think that's an excellent example, Sean. I think it ties into kind of like something of my understanding of amor fati and eternal recurrence. I think it is a kind of injunction to come to terms with the world, to affirm it in some way. And at the same time, I also want to say that it kind of acts as a consideration for ethical thought. You know, like how shall I live my life? Live it in such a way that if you had to repeat it, you would be okay with that. You know, and in that, from that perspective, I want to say Hamlet made the right choices. That's why the play is repeated over and over again. If he didn't make the choice to avenge his father's death, then we wouldn't be speaking about him and the play wouldn't be continued forever. So I think at the end, you know, it's a tragic story, but I can imagine Hamlet, you know, saying, you know, the day after the play's performed, let's do it again. Let's do it in front of a new audience because that was fun. I mean, it sucked at parts, but at the end of it, you know, I got my revenge, you know, and so yeah, I think Hamlet made the right choices. Those are, you know, the evidence for that is that we put on the play, right?
Yeah, I guess I see it as like a kind of retrospective thing. It's like it's hard to use it to live your life, but it is a good way of looking back at your life and saying, like, look, what you did was okay. You know, like maybe in a different, you know, it's just that whatever it was that you did was you, and it was unique, and it was interesting. It was interesting, and it allows you to kind of sort of continue living in some way. You know, it's, I guess maybe it's kind of the opposite of what you guys are saying. It's like the fact that it's not going to eternally recur is your freedom from it, and that you can imagine sort of it retrospectively eternally occurring is this beautiful thing.
You know, just something just occurred to me as you guys were talking. Another way of maybe thinking is that if, you know, what makes my life worth living or valuable to me, and you know, what would be the alternative to my life as it is now, or what, you know, what someone might say, well, what would be the best life? Well, the best life would be where everything really goes great and there is no suffering and there is no pain and there is no struggle. You know, you think about that for a minute, you're like, God, that would be boring and not very interesting. And so, I mean, so that maybe just think of another way of thinking about it, is affirming my life as it is to affirm the whole of it and to acknowledge that what I find valuable and meaningful, and I mean, this is kind of a new thought for me, that what I find valuable and meaningful about my life sort of necessarily includes those, what I think of as negative or suffering. You know, what I think of as suffering, without that, it's not clear my life would be worth living, because it would just be this, it's kind of like, you know, this notion of heaven, as a friend of mine once said, you know, standing for eternity in rows with other saints and angels and singing hymns to God for eternity. You know, that sounds really boring. and so maybe a life that was just uninterrupted good fortune would be equally uninteresting and boring, and maybe ultimately even worse suffering.
It reminds me of something Eric was talking about in one of our literature seminars, actually, about how his teacher spoiled Moby Dick for him, in basically arguing that, you know, the joy and the enjoyment of reading is not the spoilers, it's not the actual events, it's not like you knowing what happens at the end, it's the fact that you can go back through this book and find, you know, an infinite amount of value from reading it, you know, and from the things kind of behind it and the meaning kind of you can create from it, you know. And so in that same way, I think if we sort of think of our lives more of as a sort of fiction or as a story, we can create this sort of infinite value from it. You know, we can return back through these events and find so much meaning, and sort of instead of focusing on this event, you know, that happened and how it didn't work, or it's not what you wanted to happen or whatever, it's like that's not important. It's the meaning that you can kind of give it and eternally sort of return to.
That is exactly why I never care about spoilers. I tell people I'm perfectly happy. I'm almost excited for you to spoil whatever it is, because if you feel the need to, I'm down for it, right? Like it must mean it's good and it would be cool to hear about. But also it's just because like my feeling is that if you spoil something and then I go and I watch it and it doesn't hold up, that speaks to the poverty of the work, not the fact that you spoiled it for me.
I was going to say also, in terms of that last passage you were talking about, it finishes with, let me be a yes sayer, as a kind of aspirational. Again, I see a little, I want to say I see like a trajectory, right? Like Nietzsche views religion as life denying, and we know he went through Lutheranism and then rejected it. And I want to say in the immediate aftermath of this rejection of Lutheranism, there was much rejection, of the priests and the historical morals that have been handed us down. And I think here in the gay science, I mean, probably before the gay science, but he's reached a point where like, what was the point of denying the religion to begin with, as life denying, if I then, go on denying religion, but I don't actually turn around to rescue the thing that religion was attacking. And so I think instead of, pointing out religion as a negation and then trying to spend an entire academic career just negating the negation, there's a point where it just weighed all too much on him. He's like, that's making me sick. Why did I negate religion to begin with to affirm life? What can I do to start moving back into that kind of mindset where I'm affirming life? And, I think that's something of what he's trying to do. And even where like the parts in his writings where he's a little bit more conciliatory towards, religion and its contribution, even one of the ones we read today kind of sees it as like a proto-science. I'm kind of stretching it a bit here. I think there's good cause for that. I think he's conciliatory, and it's a part of that, no longer trying to negate that negation, but to actually just rest in it, in an affirmation.
Yeah, I think through like Kierkegaard and also these Ingmar Bergman movies I've been watching recently. I've been sort of doing a similar thing with Christianity. I've been kind of returning to it and trying to find the value in it and the things in it that I really genuinely related to when I was younger, instead of denying it as a whole, and rejecting everything about it just because it failed to do certain things that I needed it to do at the time. So I really relate to that. I it's more personal, I think, and it's not maybe this sort of entire, like my rejection of Christianity is less, I think, in its social implications and more in the way it just made me feel. But I think it's sort of my way of relating to that. So
I think I'm gonna duck, guys, just so I have a little bit of time between this and the next thing I was gonna do. I wanted to ask, are the recordings still going up out of curiosity? Just because I kind of was kind of going back and looking at them on.
Do you want me do you want me to turn the recording off? Is that, or?
Oh no! I
Oh.
mean like I mean like in general, like are they going up online?
You'd have to ask Chase, who is kind of incognito at the moment. So what happens is I record them and then I send them to Chase, and then Chase may use them for toilet paper or something. I really don't know. He doesn't tell me.
Yeah, I was just a little bit curious. I kind of been watching them, and then right, and then I got to the end of what was on there, and then I kind of then I was like, oh well, I have to go back and like watch the Birchstone lectures or something. But I was kind of enjoying keeping up with the Kierkegaard ones and the Nietzsche ones. So I just wanted to mention it. But it's been cool talking with you guys. It's been interesting. And yeah, I'll see you later.
Yeah, they're up on YouTube. At least the ones I've gotten. I think a few. I don't think you sent. I think 2 or so to me, David. But yeah, there's a few up there.
If I miss some, please maybe send me an email message, because I've been saving them on Media Flow, which is the UT, or sorry, Texas State media thing. So I should still have them. So if you want them, let me know. Well, we have 10 minutes. If you guys want to stop, we could, or I've got another passage we could talk about. Do you guys have any preference?
I'm basically trying to write my essay right now, so I'm just listening to you guys mainly, but I'll keep listening for another 10 minutes, so sure.
I'll take another passage.
Okay, well, what I was gonna look at was section 296. He calls it a firm reputation. I put my subtitle of against authenticity. And I was just curious about this because, you know, he says a firm reputation used to be of the, you know, really important because it has great utility, social utility, you know, of people, because you can depend upon people to be the same all the time. And so that when you need them to do something in the future, you know, you can draw on them because they're always the same. But then he says that's not really good for searchers for knowledge, because the searcher for knowledge has to be able to kind of jettison or at least call everything into question. And so and he says in the middle, such esteem which blooms and has bloomed everywhere along the morality of custom fosters character and brings all change, relearning, and self-transformation into ill repute. However, the greatest advantage of this normativity is to this, anyway. So, and maybe I'm reading too much into there, but so the attitude of the seeker after knowledge, which is incompatible with a firm reputation, is considered dishonorable, while the petrification of opinions has all the honor to itself. Still today, we must live under the spell of such standards. I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I think of this idea in philosophy and other places that this notion of integrity and consistency and so on. And I'm wondering, I guess, what is he suggesting here? Is he, because he does talk about things like, having a dominating instinct, which generates a sort of a coherent character, which can, be the flame of creativity for a person, which sounds like it is a kind of consistency. But anyway, curious on what your thoughts are.
I particularly like that passage. I remember reading it and thinking about what your thoughts would be, because one of my first thoughts was to the profession of philosophy. And I think Nietzsche's hitting on something really important, because I think just at a basic level, we can intuit there's a real value to being able to scrutinize all of your beliefs, to be Christian and then to scrutinize all of the beliefs of Christianity, to leave it, you know what I mean? And then maybe a step beyond that, to scrutinize the scrutiny, you know what I mean? But especially philosophers, and less so, specialist scientists, for example, who just have to operate within a paradigm, right? But then the revolutionary scientists are the ones who can look at the whole paradigm and see a flaw with it, and perhaps, bring in modifications or bring in a new paradigm. And that's how we drive knowledge forward, not by the scientists who just, continue with the technical details, but the ones who can think of new paradigms, and they can only think of new paradigms because they have a willingness to question the existing paradigm. And that's in the sciences. I want to say philosophy demands even more, that you have to be able to go all the way and question all of your beliefs if you're going to really, really commit to doing philosophy, right? But at the same time, professional philosophers must be in a dilemma. If in order to get a job teaching, right, you need to have a bit of a, you need to publish, you need to start establishing a professional reputation. When students sign up for your class, and you have years of espousing existentialism, and then first day you want to, say, all right, guys, existentialism is a load of bunk. What did they sign up for, and what are they getting? And are some of the students going to be annoyed? I think there are a number of philosophers who we can point to and say they changed their minds on different things over the points of their career. I think that's a great thing. I think it right now, sociologically, that's where what our university system is amounted to today. It kind of puts professional philosophers in a position where they're asked to stop being philosophers to a point. You know what I mean? You have to commit to establishing a reputation as a thinker within a specific field and with a specific orientation. And if you ever want to just abandon that field or completely reverse your orientation in that field, what does that do to your, like professional reputation and prospects for landing positions in universities?
Yeah, I think I have a real sort of problem with you know, turning my interest in philosophy or literature or sort of anything that I'm truly interested in, and am sort of comfortable with it changing me as making that my profession, or as sort of making money doing that or whatever, and I think something, despite the fact that it is something I'm interested in doing, it is like I would like to have my profession be something that's meaningful to me. But I think there's certain sacrifices you have to make in that, and yeah, I don't know. I think authenticity is really important to me, but I also sort of see authenticity as being willing to follow something even if it destroys everything that you were, and being able to follow something that can break you entirely or ruin everything, and so to me, like, that authenticity has more to do with a sort of feeling than it does these sort of rational things that you can hold on to. And so, for me, I think Nietzsche is kind of rejecting that definition of authenticity as being true to like a definitive version of yourself that you're presenting, and I think that most creators who I respect kind of see themselves as fragmented in some way, as being a themselves and then also whoever they are professionally, and that they have to kind of move ideas back and forth between their true self and their professional kind of persona, but that doesn't make their professional persona any less them. It's a part of them and it's important. And I think that that's something I struggled with, was thinking that if it's professional, it's a mask and it's not me. But I do think there's value to it, and in the process of kind of moving things back and forth, you actually sort of learn more about yourself, I think. So
I agree entirely. I feel like the notion of authenticity, if it's really, if we want to look at it, authentically or honestly, it should contain self change. Like, you shouldn't feel the need to be consistent for the sake of being authentic to yourself. If there's something in you that's pushing you to experiment or to radically revise, I mean, was David Bowie not a authentic music? I'm not a huge fan of David Bowie, but he reinvented himself many times. Was he being inauthentic, or was he one of the few people who knew how to be authentic because he was able to reinvent himself many times? Well, I mean, even jazz musicians over their career, like Miles Davis, how many different forms of jazz did he play with? And he shifted around because he was authentically. I want to say there's probably something underneath all of that in the case of Miles Davis, and probably in the case of David Bowie, and probably the case of other philosophers and artists. There's something probably largely unchanging that's driving what on the surface to us looks like radical changes.
yeah, and I think the to me, the aspect of that thing that is unchanging is that it can never be reached, that there's no sort of way of explaining it or describing it or prescribing it to other people, and if you're sort of if your authenticity isn't sort of driven by something that isn't explicable, or that is explicable, I think it's not truly authentic.
I feel like I shouldn't confess these things, but I don't publish. which means I will never be a tenured professor. You know, I am, and part of the reason, I mean, at least 50% of the reason I don't publish is because I'm lazy. But 50% of it is because kind of like these problems, I just don't, I don't actually know. I have relatively few beliefs, you know, things that I really believe. Because it's just, you know, I have a really hard time coming down someplace on most issues and saying, well, I have seen a good enough argument to believe that this is the case or that's the case. I just, you know, I just don't get there on most issues. And so like the way I present stuff in classes, I mean, and this is kind of a mask, I guess you could say, rather than say, I almost never say, well, this is what I believe, or this is what I think, or here's my argument. I almost always present, well, this is what this philosopher says, and this is what this philosopher says. And sometimes they agree and sometimes they don't. And so I take my role more as explicating these views and then leaving it to the students to decide themselves. And part of that's because I think that's the right thing to do. And part of it's because I just don't have a good enough reason to, you know, to come down hard. I mean, sometimes like when we were reading that stuff by James, and it seemed to me he was implicitly endorsing what's that called when you cut on live animals? Vivisection. Now that I felt very strongly about, and I said, this is just not good. I don't like this. But that doesn't happen very often. I mean, usually it's like, you know, Nietzsche and James, actually, I thought it was very interesting. They have some very similar views epistemologically, but they conclude very different things from that. And I find myself more attracted to Nietzsche, but I'm not sure I could give you an argument that says Nietzsche is superior in some objective way. And so I just, you know, I guess I mean, I kind of feel, maybe this gives me a little bit of comfort, passages like that, because I'm like, I don't know, you know, and one of the difficult things about that challenges, I guess, to me, that I see Nietzsche making, like you see in Beyond Good and Evil, where at least on my reading, he's making a case for remaining, for keeping sort of that skeptical stance as much as possible, but nevertheless choosing, which is, I think probably, you know, you see this reflected in Existentialists who borrowed from him, but the problem I have is I am forever caught on the horns of these dilemmas, and how am I supposed to choose, given that I'm hung on these dilemmas? And I hear people like Nietzsche and Sartre saying, well, yeah, that's the way it is, but you still have to choose, because if you don't choose, then your life is going to be just doing nothing. You know, if you want your life to have value and meaning in sort of a coherent and structured way, that you lived for something, you did something, you stand for something, you have to choose. But you have to choose realizing that choice is forever not ultimately defensible. I mean, it may be relatively defensible to some other views, but it's not like you can say, well, I choose this view because I know it's right. And so that's the difficulty I have is, you know, I mean, I don't have to maintain the skepticism. It's just the way I am. It's like, shit, I don't know. You know, students ask me, you think this is right or this is right? I don't know. I can tell you why I like this one more than that one, but I'm not sure I can tell you that this one's right and that one's definitely wrong. And so how do I make meaningful choices in the face of those kind of dilemmas? I'm an old guy. I'm old. I should have figured this out by now. You know, Hunter kind of tells me that sometimes. He's like, I need help figuring this shit out. I'm like, I'm sorry. Can't help you. I'm kind of like Socrates. I don't know a damn thing. So anyway, that's where I am.
Well, as a young person, I can say that I relate heavily to all the things you just said, Demet. I just, you know, I feel like for some reason I have to convince myself that even if I do nothing with my life, it was still meaningful, and valuable. And in some way, the interactions I had with people, that they meant something, whether or not I published something or created anything, which are things that I do want to do, but also seem so far off from what I'm able to do now. It's like, I just, I have to, and this is what I think Nietzsche's saying, along with this sort of like, hey, you should do something, is also, look, if you don't do something, that's perfectly okay, and that everything that you did was still meaningful, and you'll never really truly know the meaning of it, but the people around you were changed by you, and you had an effect on them, and that should be enough, I think. So. You're muted, Nevin.
One thing I take a little comfort in, again, is the be who you are thing. Actually, Travis, it was something you said, maybe it was last week, that I keep coming back to. When we were talking about, I was having that problem. How do I create a myth and then live in it authentically, knowing I made this shit up? And I forgot what you said, but what the exact comment was, but what it caused me to think, and maybe this is kind of what living authentically would be, maybe for Nietzsche, is that rather than trying to consciously, rationally construct some kind of story, and you've made comments like this. You made a comment like this just a few minutes ago. I can't remember what it was again, but that being who you are is about living consistently with the values that you find emerging through your own action. And so it becomes something you discover about yourself, and something it sounds like a teenager, right? I need to define myself, but maybe there's a little bit of wisdom there, that rather, because I'm in my head so much, rather than trying to create some rational construction that I can then believe in, maybe it's more a matter of allowing who and what I am to emerge through my action. And then maybe as that comes into my consciousness and I become aware of that, maybe then I can start thinking about it in a more reflective way. But anyway, so something you said last week was really helpful for me in that regard. Well, it's 7:06. Shall we adjourn?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
Just going to keep on studying. Poor Chase.
Good luck, Chase.
Good luck, Chase.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that was fun. I kind of was like drifting in and out of hearing what you guys were saying, and it was all very significant. I may have to just listen to the recording. So I can't watch these recordings because I can't watch or listen to myself without feeling bad.
Same problem.
I like listening to other people, but I hate my recorded self. Yeah. I like my live self. It's okay, but yeah, not recorded self. Yeah.
Anybody want a green bean?
Yeah, I'll take
Yes.
it.
Well,
I am hungry.
it's not working.
Good
Okay.
effort.
See you guys next week.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.